One phenomenon that I'd noticed long before this in free speech debates is what I call censorship envy, which is to say that when everybody is allowed to speak and everybody's allowed to say things that offend everybody else, some group that's offended might say, well, we're upset by this speech, but look, everybody's got to deal with offensive speech in our society.
It's not just pitting liberal values against illiberal values, navigating a tension between two liberal values. One's equal protection, one's free speech.
Well, I'm all in favor of equality. I just think it should be equality of freedom and not equality of repression. The problem is much more complicated. You need to kind of create an affirmative culture of free inquiry where people are encouraged to seriously discuss issues rather than just label them anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, racist, sexist, woke, commie, whatever else. Like, you want students to say, okay, here you're making an argument about what Hamas did or about what Israel did or about whatever else. Let's talk seriously about it.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hi, and welcome to The Contrarian. I'm your host, David Bernstein. Today we speak with Eugene Volokh, Professor Eugene Volokh, who's really a leading light in the legal world and somebody I've been very eager to talk to about some of the challenges that we're facing on campuses today, at universities today, some of the tensions, both legal and cultural. Thank you, Professor Volokh, for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Right. So I started working on a paper with my namesake, David E. Bernstein, George Mason. I know you know him well. And we were looking at the tension between free speech on campus and equal protection of Jewish students on campus. And this is a tension that I know he's thought a lot about and I've thought a lot about. And then, of course, October 7th happens, and these issues are not just front and center for the Jewish world, they're front and center, and the legal world, they're front and center for society. Maybe I can characterize it this way, perhaps you'll help me out here. That, on the one hand, there's a whole series of protections that are often extended to minority groups on campuses, Title VI and others, and Jews often are not being afforded those protections. Now, if you're a free speecher like me, you'd rather that no one had them in a way. You'd rather that that our universities are both ideologically neutral and value free speech. Yet that's not the state of play on a lot of campuses. And so we're trying to figure out how to navigate that challenge between, on the one hand, being free speechers who want to see universities ultimately value free speech the way that we feel many haven't. And on the other hand, we don't want Jews to be subject to a different standard as other protected minorities. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that framing.
Sure. So one phenomenon that I'd noticed long before this in free speech debates is what I call censorship envy, which is to say that when everybody is allowed to speak and everybody's allowed to say things that offend everybody else, some group that's offended might say, well, we're upset by this speech, but look, everybody's got to deal with offensive speech in our society, given the First Amendment, given free speech and academic freedom protection, so we're just going to ignore it or we're going to rebut it or whatever else. But then if you see other groups being protected, so to speak, from speech, which is to say speech that offends them is suppressed, then a lot of people say, well, if those groups get to suppress speech that offends them, then what kind of chump am I for not asking for the same for me and for my group? So the consequence is, just because of human nature, I think this phenomenon is particularly important because it resonates so much with just the way ordinary humans understandably react to the world. Because of human nature, when people see some speech being censored, then they want to try to equalize it by having other speech being censored. I think the right answer, and the one that the Constitution calls for, at least for public universities, and that broader free speech and academic freedom principles call for all universities, including private ones, is to equalize in favor of more protection rather than less protection. So yes, it's true that there have been incidents, for example, in the past where display of Muhammad cartoons in the academic context, there have been attempts to try to suppress that. Well, the answer to that is to prevent such attempts and resist such attempts, rather than say, well, all right, since people are trying to suppress that, we should also suppress other speech that's offensive to Jews or Israelis or whoever else. Likewise, with regard to speech that is seen as offensive by some blacks or women or whatever else, all that speech, again, likewise, if it's offensive to whites or men, ought to be protected. And simply the fact that there have been mistakes, in fact, a lot of mistakes at many universities in suppressing speech, doesn't mean we ought to be suppressing still more speech. And I think that's particularly true and particularly important with regard to speech about Israel. So, for example, we see some people, Representative Stefanik was one example, seeming to suggest that, of course, universities need to suppress calls for genocide. She had in mind genocide of Jews, and she was defining genocide quite broadly, not just mass extermination of every Jew, which thankfully very few people are calling for, but including things like the Hamas attack on civilians. Well, already we are seeing people condemning what Israel is doing in Gaza as genocide. I actually disagree with them on the substance. I think the Israeli incursion into Gaza is quite justified under the laws of war and international human rights law. But their view is that, and lots of people take that view, well, if advocacy of genocide is seen as unprotected at university campuses, it's quite obvious that, because of the same phenomenon, that's going to be deployed against pro-Israel students who want to say, look, the incursion on Gaza, bloody as it is perfectly justified. In fact, maybe should be undertaken even more strenuously. That is speech that I think needs to be fully protected. But if universities start censoring anti-Israel speech or speech that defends Hamas attacks on Israel, perfectly clear they're going to also start trying to do the same with regard to pro-Israel speech that supports the incursion into Gaza. Again, I think morally the two are very different. But I have no reason to think that university administrators who are going to be actually applying these new speech restrictions are going to agree with my moral judgment. Better by far, it seems to me, is to allow more speech rather than try to go into a spiral of more and more restriction.
Right. So I want to return to this issue of the university presidents and that fateful day on Capitol Hill. But I want to sort of probe a little bit more into this idea of free speech versus, as someone put it, equal protection of Jews. I think the argument is that, okay, of course, free speech is a primary liberal value in society, but also equal protection is a primary liberal value. So if you have universities that have these very elaborate microaggression policies, as many do, and they have a history of not really applying free speech in all of their affairs and certainly applying it to other minority groups, it's very easy to get in trouble if you say the wrong thing in many universities, including many public universities. The failure to apply those same standards to Jewish students is actually a kind of violation of a liberal value too. And it's not just pitting liberal values against illiberal values. It's navigating a tension between two liberal values. One's equal protection, one's free speech.
Well, I'm all in favor of equality. I just think it should be equality of freedom and not equality of repression. Just to give an analogy, imagine we see that some police force is disproportionately beating black suspects. What's the answer to that? Oh, well, if you've beaten some black suspects, you need to beat some more white suspects too. I would hope not. I think the answer would be, look, this was bad, assuming the beatings were unjustified. Sometimes, of course, there are going to be situations where they have to use force in self-defense or to arrest, but let's assume it's unjustified. The answer is, look, they were unjustified. We need to punish the people who were involved in those things to the extent that they were deliberate. And we need to make sure that police don't unjustifiably beat suspects of any race, rather than to say, well, now that you've started down the course of going after black suspects, you need to do the same with regard to white suspects. I don't think that's right at all. Now, it's true in some situations, you might say, there are two plausible situations. We might have, for example, a rule that says no sound amplification at political rallies. And it could, on campus at universities, because universities should be a place where people can quietly study. And if that's applied to one kind of rally, it should be applied to other kinds of rally. Or we could have a rule that says, no, some amount of sound amplification is allowed, because both kinds of equal treatment are reasonable conclusions. You can have reasonable debates about whether there ought to be more or less this, sound amplification at demonstrations at universities. But if the call is for suppressing anti-Israel speech, or suppressing even pro-Hamas speech because other speech had been suppressed before. That seems to me, again, unjustifiable call for equality of repression rather than equality of freedom. And by the way, I should say, I'm a supporter of Israel, but of course it's permissible to criticize Israel, even harshly and unfairly criticize Israel, even calling for the destruction of Israel. I think that would be quite unjustified and immoral, but the fact is, not every ethnic group has its own country. Basques may want their own country, Kurds may want their own country, Palestinians may want their own country. Doesn't necessarily mean they need to have them. Now, I do think that if a group has a country, then trying to destroy that country would be an extremely bloody process. Nonetheless, this is something that we as Americans need to talk about, and that includes when there's killing involved. World War II was ended, at least under some plausible accounts. It's an interesting question what caused Japan to surrender, but may have been ended by the fact that we, in two instances, killed over 150,000 Japanese, including many civilians. Now, some people say that was a war crime. I totally disagree, but some people take that view. Other people say, well, there were some military targets there. I'm not sure that's what really brought Japan to surrender. But even if I'm wrong, this is the kind of thing that people need to be able to debate, both as to the past events, and as to future events. So this is something that universities have to be free spaces for. They, of course, also have to be free spaces for discussions of race and of sex and of sexual orientation and gender identity. To the extent they failed in that respect, that's bad. But we shouldn't add to that failure by more equal failure with regard to protecting speech about Israel.
So what do you make of Title VI more generally, and these Title VI claims that some, not just Jews, have availed themselves of, but other minority groups have, that there's a hostile environment on campuses? How do you think about that?
Well, so a lot depends on what you mean by hostile environment. I've long criticized hostile environment terminology, in part because it is so vague and potentially broad. Nonetheless, there are some kinds of hostile environment claims that are perfectly legitimate because universities do have some obligations. So, for example, if universities aren't protecting Jews from anti-Semitic violence, or blacks from anti-black violence, or whites from anti-white violence, then they might be liable under Title VI. I totally agree that all students should be protected, and faculty should be protected to the extent university can from violence. Real violence, not this speech we're going to call violence. Likewise, that's true with regard to threat of violence or threat of illegal conduct. That is speech, but indeed the law treats threats of illegal conduct as constitutionally unprotected. There's a First Amendment exception for true threats. So if indeed Jewish students are being threatened, then in that case they deserve protection. And if they don't get this protection on a discriminatory basis, they can sue under Title VI. Likewise, when it comes to certain kinds of targeted personal insults, like let's say somebody starts sending messages to Jewish students, particular individual Jewish students, addressed directly to them. And they say, look, stop talking to me. I don't want to hear your either anti-Semitic insults, or for that matter, your tirades about Israel, which may not be anti-Semitic, but you're targeting me as a Jewish student for that. I just don't want to hear that anymore. I think it may make sense. It's an interesting question, but it may make sense for the rule to be that universities ought to essentially allow people to have kind of a stop talking to me power, like a little veto and continued speech to them. But if the claim is the hostile environment is created by speech that is sharply anti-Israel, not said to particular students, but said to the campus at large, but they're offended by it because they're Jewish, or for that matter, because they're of Israeli national origin, well, then the answer is that's not something that Title VI should be read as covering. There's some possible authority for reading it that broadly. I think the answer is not to read it that broadly. And when it comes to court, I think courts should and will conclude that Title VI does not mandate universities suppress certain viewpoints. In fact, when campus speech codes at public universities that were framed in this hostile environment harassment terms have come to court, courts have generally held they're unconstitutional to the extent that they're being used, or that they're written broadly enough to be used to suppress particular viewpoints. More broadly, Title VI is a statute. It's an important federal statute, but it's just a statute. It's just as subject to the First Amendment as other statutes are. And, the First Amendment protects speech that endangers various kinds of values. It protects speech that endangers a war effort. It may protect a lot of speech that endangers national security. Protects speech that endangers the police by, say, sharply condemning the police in a way that may egg on physical attacks of the police. Likewise, it protects anti-Semitic speech, racist speech, anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim speech, and the like.
So I want to put out another scenario, a specific scenario. A former colleague of mine, Ken Stern, who's also a lawyer and has thought deeply about these issues. He was actually one of the authors of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which has become a much disputed but important definition of anti-Semitism that has often been used by various governments, including the U.S. government. Ken has argued that anti-Zionism should not be viewed as a category of discrimination. So at Berkeley Law School, for example, when a group of Berkeley law students signed a pledge not to have any Zionist speakers at any of their events, that could not be fairly regarded as a kind of discrimination because it was not based on race, religion, or national origin, because Zionism is a political philosophy. Now, others would argue that Zionism is integral to who Jews are, and as a result, should be viewed as a sort of a proxy for Jews. In other words, when you say we're discriminating against the Zionists, you're really discriminating, or Zionism, you're really discriminating against American Jews who are largely Zionists. Do you agree with Ken on making that distinction? Or do you think that it is a form of discrimination?
Well, to me, I don't much care from my perspective whether opposition to Zionism is viewed as anti-Semitic or not, because it is constitutionally protected speech in any event. But I do think that, conceptually they're quite different. And one way of thinking about it is, I hear there are some people who don't believe the Palestinians ought to have a separate state of their own. I'm actually not completely sure. I think a lot depends what they do with that state, but that certainly is a legitimate view. Should that view be treated as discrimination under anti-discrimination law? No. It's a First Amendment protected view that anti-discrimination law can't suppress. Should it be treated as a proxy for anti-Muslim sentiment or even anti-Palestinian ethnic sentiment? No. I mean, it's true some people who take that view may also dislike Palestinians as people, just like some people who are anti-Zionist or anti-Israel may dislike Jews or Israelis as people. But one can certainly say that, look, I'm perfectly fine hiring Palestinians for various jobs, educating them. I'll treat them the same way. I just don't think that the people who happen to be related to Palestinian Americans half a world away are entitled to have a country that they are governing in this particular space. And again, the same thing is true with regard to a lot of other disputes. I happen to think that Taiwan deserves independence. Others may disagree. But of course, the view either that Taiwan deserves independence or the view that Taiwan doesn't deserve independence They're not discrimination against Taiwanese or discrimination against mainland Chinese in any kind of legally cognizable way, as opposed to kind of as a matter of political rhetoric or as a matter of psychological conjecture. They are fully protected views about how international order ought to be set up.
So if Berkeley Law School or some other law school said, we're not going to allow any Jewish students to speak to our student groups, that would be a violation of our anti-discrimination laws. But if they say we're not going to allow any students with a Zionist point of view to speak, would you agree that one is a form of discrimination and another isn't?
Well, let's be precise here. So you said if Berkeley Law School were to say we're not going to allow any Zionist speakers to speak to any of our groups, that would be discrimination. It would be discrimination based on political viewpoint. Berkeley Law School is a public university, right, and is governed by the First Amendment, and therefore cannot engage in that kind of discrimination. To be sure, it's a different kind of discrimination, but Berkeley Law School is prohibited from both kinds. Now, let's say that a private employer to take an example, Pennsylvania, says, I will not hire Jews. That does violate anti-discrimination law. If he says, I will not hire Zionists, that probably wouldn't, because Pennsylvania law does not prohibit discrimination in employment by private employers based on politics, based on ideology. I use Pennsylvania as an example, by the way, because in California, it would be illegal because there is a California law that bans discrimination based on political activity, including ideological beliefs. So when it comes to actual discrimination, say in hiring, there might be differences. And it's an interesting question. One question would be when this particular employer says, I don't want to hire Zionists, is the real reason, is the real motivation a desire not to hire Jews? That is something that might arise in that kind of employment context. But when it comes to speakers, speakers are entitled to express anti-Zionist views and are entitled to express anti-Semitic views. Right. In that respect, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are similar in that both are protected speech. What about student groups inviting speakers? There, I think that a student group generally ought to be entitled to choose to invite speakers based on any criteria they want. If they say, we want a Jewish speaker on some subject because we're a Jewish students group and we want speakers who express the Jewish viewpoint on certain things, I think they should be free to do that. And if they say, we don't like Jews, we're not going to invite Jewish speakers, they should be free to do that too. That's particularly clear, I think, with regard to religious groups. So somebody might very well say, look, we're a Catholic students group, we want to have Catholic speakers. And some other group might say, we're a Protestant student group, we're of a particular denomination that really has sharply disapproved of Catholicism, and we're fine with Jewish speakers and Muslim speakers, but not Catholic speakers, because we think Catholicism is an evil religion. Now, my view, I think student groups should be free to do that. Now, some universities might say, look, if you're using university resources, we're going to prohibit that kind of discrimination in selection of speakers. Whether that's permissible or not, I think is complicated. But as a matter of what's the right thing to do, I think student groups should be free to do that. And to the extent that people say, oh, that's a bigoted decision, so it's not just kind of a reasonable judgment that, we want to have one particular viewpoint, but it's a judgment that stems from hatred and prejudice, well, then you've learned something valuable about the group. One value of free speech is it helps let you know what other people are thinking. It helps you figure out who your enemies are. That is a tremendously, tremendously valuable resource, that kind of knowledge.
Sure. Before we move on from there, it seems to me that a Catholic group deciding it wanted to only have Catholic speakers, being Catholic is germane to that group's mission, but let's say it's an environmental student group and it says it doesn't want a Jewish speaker. It would seem to me that that's a harder case to make, although you're saying that still wouldn't be an impermissible form, at least at a legal level, an impermissible form of discrimination?
Well, why are you saying that it's not germane? Obviously, they think it's germane. If they were to say no Jewish speakers, and I don't think in Berkeley that's what they were saying, if they were to say no Jewish speakers, presumably it's because they have some twisted vision of environmentalism in which Jews are bad for the environment. That's their mission. That's what's germane to their mission. And again, it's useful to note that that's their sense of the mission. So one thing that I've noticed, I suspect you've noticed it too, is how many people have said in the wake of the post-October 7th protests at campuses that they're shocked about how much hostility there is to Israel, but also to Jews. And, that in part because they do think that a lot of the anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, and in fact, they may be right. It may be the case that at least some people who express those views are also anti-Semitic. So they're shocked and surprised. Well, another way of saying shocked and surprised is they've learned from it, right? That speech has conveyed to them something very important about the magnitude of anti-Semitism out there, and in some measure, the sources of anti-Semitism. I think, for example, a lot of Jews were well aware of anti-Semitism from the right, and there has been some. In the past, there's been a good deal. Nowadays, there certainly is some, including anti-Semitic violence and anti-Semitic murders from some on the far right. But they've been shocked about how much is coming from the left, the so-called, the supposedly progressive left. Well, that's a tremendously important source of information about what Jews should do going forward. Whom they should enter into coalitions with, maybe what conditions they should insist on when entering into a coalition with a group, whom they can trust, whom they would distrust. That is tremendously, tremendously important. To put another way, imagine, and there's a limit to this analogy, but imagine that there was a real war, not just a war of ideas or a war of words, but that in America, obviously there's a real war in Israel and Palestinian territories, but in America there was a real war, and you were in the intelligence department of one side, and the other side is saying really awful things about what they really believe and what they're going to do and how they're going to act. And then somebody says, "Oh, we should see what we can do. We should bomb the stations that are promoting that." I think your reaction might well be, "No, don't touch them." This is tremendously valuable for us. It gives us a much better sense of who is really on their side. Makes it much easier for us to establish our positions to our prospective allies by pointing out what our enemies really believe. Speaking of war, there's this old line from Napoleon, or credited Napoleon, maybe slightly mistranslated from Napoleon. Never interrupt the enemy while he's in the middle of making a mistake. That's my view about anti-Semitic speech and anti-Zionist speech on campus.
Yeah, just to support what you're saying, in the wake of October 7th, there were a lot of very, very radical groups who brazenly cheered on Hamas. And they came out with social media memes and the like, with the hang glider memes and others. And, on the one hand, one can be horrified by that. On the other hand, one can then take that information and say, these are groups that are trying to sign contracts with school districts in California, and maybe a superintendent might not want to work with that particular group if they're cheering on Hamas. In other words, their speech can also be used in a way that limits their ability to have influence in society. I want to go to that testimony that we all heard in Congress with the university presidents, and obviously that was a key moment. Now, on the one hand, from a strictly legal perspective, you could say that the university presidents had a point. On the other hand, and I think this is what people were reacting to, is that these universities in particular have all lousy records when it comes to free speech. I think Harvard and Penn are dead last and second to last according to the FIRE rankings as free speech cultures among the universities. So these are places that haven't had a very good track record with free speech in recent years, and yet their presidents came and talked a good game about free speech. So how do you think we should think about that testimony? Should we be aghast at their hypocrisy, or should we say, well, at least they're saying the right things now, even if they haven't been very good about implementing it on their campus. So let's just cheer them on from here on out.
Well, maybe both. Maybe we should say, look, it's good that they are acknowledging the importance of protecting even speech that many people understandably find extremely offensive and advocating murder or defending murder. But at the same time say, well, where were you on all these other incidents? We don't demand, again, that you equalize in the favor of repression. We want you to equalize in favor of freedom, but we want to highlight all of the bad things that have happened, all of the restrictions on speech that have happened at your universities. This is an excellent opportunity to show that, and maybe to help prevent this from happening in the future. Here's one way of thinking about it. My hope is that what we're going to see now, just as a matter of kind of political power, as it were, or kind of the political alignment, is to have an alliance between general free speech supporters and people who, on the right, who are worried about their speech being restricted, but bring back the old progressives who used to be, generally speaking, many of them at least pretty pro-free speech, but a lot have, I think, shifted away. Bring them back. Have a new pro-free speech alliance. People who may disagree with each other, people who might even kind of sharply, morally disapprove of one another, but would say, you know, we all have a joint interest in protecting speech. That's my hope. My fear is there's going to be a alliance going the other way. That the progressives are going to keep saying, or at least some of the progressives keep saying, yeah, you know, it's too bad that they're trying to restrict pro-Hamas speech, but at least it's important that they restrict other kinds of speech. And now some conservatives or some moderates say, well, all right, we've seen the light. We need to have more speech restriction. That's my fear. Again, the question is, do you equalize in favor of freedom? That's my hope. Or do you equalize in favor of repression? That's my fear.
Right. Now, there are people who are saying that once you extend sort of the hate speech codes and the repression, as you're putting it, to Jews and to other perceived, non-protected minority groups, that it will the contradiction will actually bring down the whole thing. In other words, they don't want to extend that to Jews, and if they're forced to, we may end up with something closer to free speech, because ultimately they'd rather that than have Jews or other perceived white people, I guess, be extended the same protections. Do you buy that at all?
You know, part of my worry is that I'm afraid if you're going to have more restrictions, that's just going to call for a greater spiral of restrictions. Mm-hmm. I'd rather warn of the danger of more restrictions and then hope that people look at it and say, oh, you know, the way we can avoid restrictions on, say, far left speech that is supposedly anti-colonialist and therefore anti-Israel and pro-Hamas. The only way we can avoid those restrictions is by recognizing that we need to have broad free speech protection. I think that if you just actually say, no, let's implement those restrictions and then hope you'll lobby for repealing them, I'm not sure it's going to work, because again, that they might react by just calling for more restrictions, plus also repealing something is always somewhat harder than not implementing in the first place. The other thing is, I just don't think it's right. I mean, I think, you know, sometimes you do things tactically that you might not care for in order to have, say, a bargaining chip for the future. But, you know, I think that's best avoided when those are things not that just are bad ideas, but that actually violate basic principles that we hold dear. Again, you could say, you know, the way we're going to deal with police brutality against blacks is make sure the police are also required to be equally brutal against whites. Like when the police beat some innocent black motorist or whatever, they need to find some white motorist that they'll beat up. Or if they do beat them up, because sometimes there is police brutality against whites as well as against others. You know, unfortunately, some degree of police brutality is present. More generally, well, then we're just going to leave that unpunished because we didn't properly punish somebody who attacked a black motorist. And then that was what will finally have a movement in order to have a movement in support of reducing police brutality. You know, I understand that argument. I'm not sure it will work practically, but in any case, no, I don't endorse the notion of more race-based police beatings, even if the long-term consequence might be some degree of more constraint on police brutality.
Yeah. So there's a lot of talk today about major structural reform at universities. Some people are calling for an end to diversity, equity, inclusion bureaucracies, which I argue, that are generally speaking, anti-stifling of free inquiry and free speech cultures. But also, there are these very deeply rooted academic departments that have been around since the late 1960s that arguably are not very scholarly, and sort of perpetuate an illiberal campus environment. I'm trying to. I would love to get your read on that. Do you agree that the campus has, by and large, become a deeply illiberal place, noted exceptions?
Well, so there's several different things going on here. One is, what do you do about DEI bureaucracies? What do you do about various kinds of departments that are seen as not sufficiently scholarly, maybe too ideologically biased in their scholarship? Those are interesting and important questions about university administration, university structure. I'm glad people are thinking about them, but I just don't know enough about them to be able to opine sensibly. Maybe it turns out that they're just fine, or maybe it turns out that at some universities they're just kind of activist advocacy shops, and at others they do kind of really serious, thoughtful work. Sure. I don't know. I leave it to others who do know. Now,
okay, go ahead.
There's a separate question: is have universities become deeply illiberal places? And there, I also am hesitant to opine on this, in part because it's such a general point, right? First of all, different universities are different. Second, always illiberal compared to what? That it may be that they're illiberal compared to what we think universities ought to be like, but at the same time, in an objective sense, you'd say, look, they depart from proper levels of liberty, but they're not completely illiberal. It's like, is the United States an illiberal country? Well, a lot of my hardcore libertarian friends would say, yes, absolutely. Look at all of these restrictions on economic liberty, on speech, and so on and so forth. Okay, fair enough. So it's somewhat illiberal, but is it deeply illiberal? And compared to what? Compared to a perfect libertarian utopia, or compared to what you're likely going to be able to expect in a political system where different people have very different views? So I hesitate to generalize this way. I will say there does seem to be a good deal of evidence that a lot of students are reluctant to discuss, and I don't know how many. Some polls suggest a majority, but it's often hard to tell based on a survey, are reluctant to discuss, even in thoughtful, serious ways, certain topics. Usually not for fear of being expelled from the university or suspended, but for fear of being socially ostracized by their classmates. Now, one problem is, people have in fact, probably a constitutional right not to want to hang out with people whose views they disapprove of. So they may have a constitutional right to socially ostracize, at least in many respects. So it's not like you can have a new campus rule that prevents such social ostracism. The problem is much more complicated. You need to kind of create an affirmative culture of free inquiry where people are encouraged to seriously discuss issues rather than just label them anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, racist, sexist, woke, commie, whatever else. Like, you want students to say, okay, here you're making an argument about what Hamas did or about what Israel did or about whatever else. Let's talk seriously about it. Let's recognize all of us might be mistaken in many of our views, but at the same time, even a mistaken statement might often have an important kernel of truth. Let's try to talk more about about these subjects rather than threaten people with social ostracism or cancellation, whatever that pretty broad and vague term might mean in various situations, because they dare express certain views. But that kind of culture is very hard to create. That's a really interesting and difficult question.
Yeah. Let's say some of this, though, is structural. I mean, I'm sure it differs university by university, but there's also survey data that suggests that some universities have become less open places. And let's stipulate for a second that there are certain university departments where it's very difficult to express an alternative view. Is there anything that would prevent a university from saying, look, we're going to audit our our anthropology department, because we've heard from a number of students and even one professor that it's impossible to have to express alternative ways of thinking in that department in class and the like, and the professors are very prejudicial, and they've had hiring practices over many years which have sort of made it impossible for anybody with a heterodox view to get hired. Could a university actually undertake such an audit like that and then say, I'm sorry, but this department at our university is problematic, we're going to change it? And we're going to even let go of some of the professors who may have tenure because they're not leading classes in a way that are consistent with our university values.
The devil in all of these things is very much in the details. So you say, well, fire people who have tenure because they're not leading classes in ways consistent with university values. Imagine how that standard would be applied by some universities with regard to a university professor who, for example, in class discussing the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and whether that's totally part of the subject matter, says, yeah, it's true. Many thousands of Palestinians have been killed in the incursion of Gaza, but let's talk about whether that might be a perfectly legitimate act of war. And imagine the university applying, again, that standard that you were referring to. Say, well, that's contrary to our values because it creates a hostile environment for Palestinian students or even for pro-Palestinian viewpoints. Now, I take it that's not what you're...
I'm not arguing. No, I'm not arguing that it causes a hostile environment. Quite the contrary. I'm arguing that the professors actively stifle dissent or any alternative viewpoints. So we're judging them on their ability to allow different viewpoints expressed in their classrooms, not on whether it creates a hostile environment.
All right. So now again, the devil is in the details. So if you say, if you're tenured, you can only be fired for cause. One possible cause is you're actively stifling contrary views in your classes. That's possible, but again, I'd like to know more about that. Let's say, for example, there is a professor who, when people convey some views that the professor thinks are just wrong as a matter of knowledge in the discipline, like geology professor who stifles views that the world is 6,000 years old, he's probably doing his job. And if the university were to say, no, you must allow contrary views, it's at least plausible for the professor to say, look, one of the judgments I have to exercise in running my class is which contrary views are really useful and interesting to discuss, and which contrary views are just so far out there that they're just a distraction from class conversations. So it ends up being very complicated, which is why I would be reluctant to endorse those kinds of proposals. And more importantly, I would need to know a lot more about what exactly is being proposed and how exactly one is going to implement that. In principle, I do agree that universities have an obligation to their students to make sure that material is not just taught, but taught well, and that one form of teaching well is make sure that they're exposed not just to the professor's personal views, but to a wide range of views that are important to the discipline, and that they're encouraged to express their own views, again, within some limits. So in principle, yeah, you could certainly imagine a university saying, look, this is one requirement we're going to make sure that you folks comply with, and if you don't comply with it, then we may fire you for being essentially incompetent teachers or something like that. Again, I would need to know exactly what the proposal is and how it is that it's going to be implemented. And I might conclude that on balance, the cure would be worse than the disease. Maybe not, but that's one reason that I'm skeptical about some of these proposals.
Right. Yeah, I just worry that if we don't do something like that, we're going to be stuck with these really illiberal departments for good. I understand not every university is equally illiberal today, but I think there's overwhelming evidence that there's more illiberalism today in universities than there was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And you're seeing it in more and more departments. And so we have to have something that would allow us to change that culture, some tool, even
Right.
if that tool could be misused.
Right. Right. No, I totally agree. It's an important point. It is not a point that I have studied closely, unlike, for example, questions related to free speech and academic freedom.
Sure.
And I'm open to possible proposals, although, again, I'd prefer they be vetted by people who are much more knowledgeable than I am on the subject.
So there's been a lot of talk about DEI and what to do with it. There was a fascinating debate between Yashka Monk, who's a political theorist, just came out with a book called The Identity Trap, and Chris Rufo, who's this major political activist that I'm sure you've heard of, others have heard of, who's been pushing to ban DEI, among other things, and to change the universities. Some of the legislation that's been proposed in places like Florida and Texas does more than one thing. It might ban DEI in state universities, but it also might ban the teaching of what's called divisive concepts, like critical race theory. Now, I would argue that it is perfectly acceptable and justifiable to say we don't think diversity, equity, inclusion programs are advancing the aims of the university. We believe that they're divisive, and that a governor or another state body should be able to disband those departments. But I think it seems to me a pretty obvious violation of free speech to ban these divisive concepts or to prevent teaching of these divisive concepts. Would you agree with that?
At the general matter, yes. Actually, the exact rules about professors' rights to speak in the classroom, not just express their own views in their scholarship, but convey their views to students who are brought there by the university, maybe sometimes required to take this class, who are going to be graded by the professor, essentially they're a captive audience. That's a difficult question. I have filed a brief in the Florida Stop Woke Act case, arguing that the particular Florida statute is indeed a violation of First Amendment principles, but there are quite plausible arguments on both sides of that question. So I don't want to overstate the degree to which the First Amendment clearly protects faculty speech in the classroom. I think it probably does, but again, it's quite complicated. This having been said, you're quite right that control over the administration of the university, control over various administrative programs, is totally within the power of the state legislature, even if control over the classroom or control over faculty scholarship is not. Academic freedom may mean a lot of things, but I don't think it means the freedom to organize your university in a particular way and have vice presidents who are in charge or vice chancellors who are in charge of various departments, and then have particular kinds of mandatory training, not academic training, but just kind of mandatory training of students or faculty or whatever else there might be, or particular processes for fielding complaints or encouraging student complaints about certain things. Those are all kind of matters of the administrative structure of the university. And it makes sense in a state university that the state legislature that created the university, that funds the university, on behalf of the taxpayers, who really are the ones who fund the university, might say, we don't think it's such a good idea to have a whole branch of the administration focused on DEI, and to the extent you want to make sure that anti-discrimination rules are enforced, it's better to have them be enforced through a different mechanism. Now, whether any particular such restructuring proposal is a good idea or not, I can't tell you because I need to know the details. And again, I'm also not an expert on how university administration effectively works. I've tried very, very hard in my 30 years in teaching to avoid administration concerns, or that is, say, avoid administrative matters as much as possible. But certainly, even if the university shouldn't be able to control faculty teaching or scholarship, I think it's quite right that the scholarship may well be so as to teaching, it certainly has the power, although it should exercise it wisely, has the power to control the administrative structure. The legislature has the power to control the administrative structure of the public universities.
Great. Well, thank you for your time and your thoughts. Actually, even though I've talked to people who I think are probably pretty well ideologically and intellectually aligned with you. You did actually part ways in many ways with, I think, some of those people and how you thought about and talked about equal protection and and repression. So I'm pleased to be able to contrast those perspectives, and really appreciate your unique and important contribution to this discussion.
Very much my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, thank you. Thank you for tuning in to The Contrarian. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to rate our podcast on Apple and Spotify. Stay connected with us on social media for more updates. Until next time, keep challenging.